All right. Well, today we're going to talk about values-driven policy making and how it shapes or how it can shape your organizational direction. And so let's start off with this. And everybody knows this. Every organization has policy, right? Policies guide decisions. They define expectations. They establish boundaries, and they influence behavior. Um, However, the most effective policies aren't created simply to control people or satisfy compliance requirements, right? Strong policies are built from your organizational values. So they can reflect what an organization believes, what it prioritizes, and how it expects their people to operate. So when you're talking about values driven policy making, that means that leaders create, revise, and implement policies based on the mission, the ethics, the culture, and the long term direction of the organization. Now, we don't see this all the time, right? We wouldn't be talking about it, but it happens. So instead of asking only what rule do we need, values driven, leaders ask deeper questions. What do we stand for? You know, what behaviors should our policies encourage? Who will be affected by this decision? How does our policy support our purpose? This matters because policies do more than regulate behavior. Okay, your policies should communicate your identity. They should tell your employees, your stakeholders, your customers, your students, and your community members that your business, your organization, what it is committed to. For example, if your organization says it values equity but has policies that create barriers to opportunity, then there's a disconnect between the stated values and the actual practice. And this is very widespread in organizations. So if your organization says it values accountability but applies policies inconsistently, then the trust breaks down, or the trust will begin to break down, right? So what we do in my company and what we do with 3XP Leadership is we provide a useful framework for understanding how values-driven policy making shapes organizational direction. Now, like I said, this is what I do in my company. Okay, so this is something that you can take advice from. This is something that you can look at and say, okay, how can I implement the same thing or something similar, right? So our first element in 3XP leadership is purpose. Okay, and we talk about purpose. Purpose asks leaders to connect the policy to the mission. So a policy should not exist in isolation, right? Our policies don't exist in isolation, right? Our policies support our company's larger reason for existing. So the leaders of my company, they're guided by a purpose. They're less likely to create a reactive or disconnected policies because of that purpose. They create policies that move the company toward its goals, right? And I help them do that too. So, and I'll say this an example for purpose. Let's say an educational institution, that it has a values-driven attendance policy, um, and it doesn't simply just focus on penalties, right? A values-driven attendance policy should reflect the institution's commitment to the student success, the accountability, the access, and the learning. The policy should help the students understand expectations while also recognizing the real barriers that may affect participation. And I talk about this with students all the time, right? But when you have purpose, right, and your purpose is meaningful is connected to the policy's mission, the purpose helps leaders ask whether the policy is helping people succeed or simply enforcing a rule, right? So when we talk about our next pillar in our framework of 3XP leadership is people. So when we talk about it in reference to value-driven policy making, then policies, we understand that the policies affect people differently. You know, that means that value-driven policy making must consider the human impact of every decision that you make, right? You must ask who is included, who is excluded, right? Who benefits, and who may unintentionally be disadvantaged. Uh, People-centered policies process, they can include like listening to employees, listening to your students, listening to customers, listening to clients or stakeholders. I should just say stakeholders overall, because that can include anybody and everybody, right? So it also requires you as a leader to understand that policies are experienced differently depending on the role, the access, the resources, or even the organizational power. Um, when people are not considered, policies may look fair on paper, but function unfairly in practice. Uh, for example, let's say you have a professional development policy that may appear equal if everyone is offered the same opportunity, right? And however, if some employees don't have schedule flexibility, supervisor support, or access to funding, then the policy may not produce an equitable outcome. So what a values-driven leader examines is whether the policy truly supports people or only appears to do so. And that's all. And that's all we're saying with the people process, with the people pillar. With the process pillar of values-driven policy making, values must be translated into systems. It's not enough for you, the leader, to say the value, integrity, fairness, the excellence, the inclusion, or the accountability, that's what you value. Your values must be embedded in the processes that guide policy development, communication, implementation, and evaluation, right? So your process are how policies are written, who participates in the decision-making process, how expectations are communicated, how policies are enforced, and how they're reviewed over time. A strong process, right, ensures that policies are not based on personal preference, politics, or temporary pressure. Excuse me. Instead, your policies are built through thoughtful analysis, stakeholder input, ethical reasoning, and alignment with your organization, right? The process also protects consistency. When policies are applied differently to different people, that's when your business or your organization loses credibility, right? So many organizations lose their top performers, their most loyal people, because of the policies are being applied differently, all because this is a different department, or all because and then you get some explanation where you don't understand or you don't see the big picture. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm gonna tell you right now, that is called an excuse. Okay, especially when it's a leader. If you're sitting there talking to your person that's questioning this, and one of the things said to you is, well, you wouldn't understand because you're not at that level, right? Actually, that's being demeaning, or saying that, well, you don't see the whole picture. That's also being demeaning to that individual. So, because evidently, if you recognize that they don't see the whole picture as a leader, or you recognize that they're not at that level, then you should help them understand that instead of saying that they're not there. And in order for them to understand that, they have to be there. Why am I saying that? It's because that has been brought to me many times, right? When I was working within an organization, and the people in their positional leadership would say things like, "Well, you don't understand because you're not at that level," and I would just smile, and just like, okay, but basically, you're demeaning me for whatever reasons, right? Okay. Anyway, again, I digress. Let's go back. So when employees begin to question whether the policy is truly about values or simply control, a clear process strengthens the trust, because your team members or people, they begin to see that decisions are guided by standards rather than favoritism or convenience, right? So when you have purpose, people, and process aligned, the result is a stronger performance. And performance is not only measured by the productivity or the financial outcomes, right? When you're talking about values-driven policy making, performance can include trust, right? And it will, okay, I'm gonna say it like this, it will include trust. It will include your employee engagement, right? Ethical behavior, organizational culture, confidence with your stakeholders, And then, of course, long-term sustainability, because that's what you want. Right? The policy should help the organization become what it claims to be, right? So this is why values-driven policymaking is so important to organizational direction, right? Policies create pathways. They will determine how your decisions are made, or they should. They should determine how your resources are distributed, or how conflicts are handled. How people are supported, how accountability is maintained, and over time, your policies will shape the culture of your organization or your business, and the culture shapes the performance. Right? Culture plays a huge part in the success of an organization. Right? Um, and as a leader, you must understand that values-driven policymaking requires courage. Right? So sometimes you're going to get a policy that reflects your business values, organization's values, and it may not be the easiest choice. Okay. It may require changing outdated practices, challenging traditions, right? Uh, Confronting any inequality, and uh, that's something as an organization I work with. I work with them in one aspect, and one of the things they were big on was tradition, and I kept letting them know your traditions don't the ones you're still practicing from 1920 or 1930 does not apply today. You can evolve your traditions, but you don't have to, because they were not equitable, and that company's no longer in business today. All right, and I saw that coming. I saw that coming well before I guess they did, and so as a leader, you might have to challenge those inequalities, or you might have to make decisions that are unpopular in the short term. However, right, your leadership is not only about maintaining comfort. Your leadership should be aligning your action with purpose, right? If you're a value-driven organization, or if you want a values-driven organization, what they do is they regularly examine whether their policies still reflect its mission and environment. As your organization grows, as society changes, policies, they got to be reviewed and updated. What worked, like I said before, 5, 10 years ago may no longer serve the people or the purpose of your company or your organization today. So you should ask, does the policy reflect who we say we are? Does it help people meet expectations? Does it promote fairness and accountability? Does it support our strategic direction? Does it strengthen or weaken our trust? Right? So in 3XP leadership, we help leaders approach policy making with greater intentions. The purpose is going to give policy meaning. The people are going to ensure the policy remains human-centered. The process creates the structure and consistency, and the performance reveals whether the policy is producing the right incomes. So value-driven policymaking is one of the most important ways leaders shape their organization's direction. So your policies aren't just rules written in manuals. They should be leadership decisions that are made visible. They should show what the organization values, what it protects, what it rewards, and what it expects. So when policies are aligned with values, they become more than compliance tools. They become instruments of culture. They become instruments of accountability and strategic direction. Just understand, through values-driven policymaking, leaders should build, and you can build an organization that are not only effective, but your organization is known for being ethical, responsible, and purpose-centered.